Well, hello there, and welcome, my friends. Now, in this early episode of the MindHack podcast, my co-host and I interview a guest who has a background in behavioral economics. Now, what is that exactly? Well, it's essentially a field of psychology that seeks to explain human behavior and the economics of decision-making. We also take time to explore how finding meaning behind your work and life is incredibly important, and how staying humble and living a life full of gratitude helps to make that happen. So shed your self-limiting beliefs and prepare to get your mind hacked.
The MindHack Podcast.
This is the MindHack Podcast, and I'm your host, Cody McLean and Ashwin Gulati. Today, we are interviewing Nate Andorsky, who is an entrepreneur and co-founder of Creative Science, a digital agency that takes a unique approach to design by combining the latest trends in behavioral economics and technology to develop websites, apps, integrations, bots, and more for nonprofits and organizations including Discovery Education, World Health Organization, and Malaria No More. Nate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
So one of the things that you mentioned was a focus on behavioral economics. Can you explain to me what this is and why it's so important to your business?
Yeah, of course. So behavioral economics, in really a nutshell, blends economic principles and psychology and really peels back the layer in regards to how humans actually make decisions in the real world. And the reason that we've integrated this into all of the work that we do is because we have this core belief at Creative Science that these digital experiences, whether they're mobile apps or websites or augmented or virtual reality, are really at their core human experiences. And I think that what we have found from doing the work that we do is it's really important that you have to first understand the human experience. How do humans actually operate on a day-to-day basis before you can build anything that's really captivating from a technical standpoint?
And how have you applied that more? Can you give me an example of how you applied that to your work at Creative Science?
Yeah, so I think a really prominent example, especially in the nonprofit space, is one of the things that a lot of the organizations that we work with want to be able to show their impact, captivate an audience, and really move them to action. And a lot of nonprofits tend to integrate numbers and statistics to show the impact and how large the issue is to get people to take action. But from the research that we've done and something called the identifiable victim effect, which basically states that there's a tendency of people to want to offer greater aid when an individual is observed under hardship rather than a group of people, kind of goes back to the saying that the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of 30 million people is a statistic. So taking that idea to really drive home and captivate people on an emotional level, lifting up these individual stories rather than these big numbers and statistics.
Yeah, and I guess that's why you have all those TV commercials where they have the sad baby or the dog and crying, right? And because that has a much greater emotional impact. And and I'm curious, what is your position, with the recent school shootings and how that's become a cultural phenomenon? I actually read an article, a very controversial article, but it actually sort of said that in order to stop all these types of shootings, one way about going to do that is to actually show the pictures. And when you go back and look at Vietnam, one of the things that started to change us culturally was when they started to have the videos and images that showed exactly what was going on. I'm curious, in your realm of behavioral economics, what is your view and perspective on how we can impact society in a positive way through these new behaviors?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point and interesting question. And I think with that, being able to show that is definitely important. And like you said, with the Vietnam Wars, it brings more of a sort of a reality to the situation. So there is also a delicate balance, though, on the flip side of not overdoing that too. So it's kind of a delicate balance between the two.
Right. It's definitely not an easy topic. In regards to behavioral economics now, is there any aspect outside of your business? Have you applied it to your personal life? Have you applied it to people you know to impact them in a positive way?
I think, these ideas and theories can really be applied to And the reason I actually originally got interested in it was because I was just interested in the way that the mind works, right? So why do we as humans sometimes make irrational decisions? So these ideas and theories, I mean, they can really be applied to any type of work, whether it's the for-profit, nonprofit space. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these ideas being integrated into the healthcare space, into the finance space, but also helping you to really understand, how does your mind actually work? What are some of the decisions you make, and how do you make those decisions to enable you to make better decisions?
All right. And that brings up the book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. I know when I read that book, personally, I was able to go back in my experience growing up where I had self-limiting beliefs of thinking I would never be anybody, I would be stupid, I would never achieve success. And then over time, my experience started to change, where I started to read books, I started to exercise, and I started to sort of build these compound habits that allowed me to achieve greater and greater success. And then I was able to look back at myself and think about how at one point I thought all these negative things about myself, and how that changed and how that must be for other people too. And when it comes to the impact of psychology and knowing yourself, I think that is instrumental in being a better person. Is there any books besides Nudge that you've read that have had a very big impact on you?
Yeah, there are. There are actually a few different books. There's a book called Habit, which just talks about the creation of habits and how habit loops work. You know, when you think about when you're trying to better yourself, right? Thinking about how to create new habits was pretty insightful in that realm. There's also a book called Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which also talks about some of these behavioral economic principles and how you can incorporate them into your everyday life. That was a really interesting book too.
So when you read Habit, I mean, did it systemize your thought processes a lot more? Or do you feel that you were doing the right things, but you weren't able to conceptualize it? Like, how did that book really impact you?
Yeah, I think that it was more so the latter. So I think, though, it was really being able to apply a framework into how habits are created and how they become ingrained in you. And it's not that I hadn't previously obviously created habits, whether good or bad, and wasn't aware of some of the things that go into that, but it just created more of a solid framework on how to create habits or how to tweak certain habits.
So just sort of transitioning a little bit here, you founded your company, Creative Science, and now you've had a focus on social organizations, nonprofit organizations. I'm curious, can you first tell me why you've had a focus on some of these organizations over just for-profit entities?
Yeah, so I, one of the things is, prior to my current company, I was part of the Startup America partnership. So they were launched with the support of the White House, and the Case Foundation was a founding partner of Startup America. And basically what the organization did is its mission was to help spur entrepreneurial communities and activities throughout the whole U.S. So this was about 5 or so years ago, back when really Silicon Valley and kind of Boston were the only places that were accepted to start a company. So we were housed in the Case Foundation offices, and that was the first time that I think it opened my eyes up into what entrepreneurship and what technology could do for the social good space. And one of the things that I realized, because my background was more tech focused, is that sometimes the social good space is a little bit behind the times in terms of technology. And technology, its power and its reach really has the ability to make change, and being able to take those ideas and those theories and apply them in the social good space, I just saw a lot of opportunity to do good.
And is that sort of where so a little bit of an odd question, but is that where you get your meaning from? Or like when you wake up every day, is that really what makes you want to wake up another day and another day? Because it's so often entrepreneurs just have this focus on profit or money or making money. And I know when you're able to have a stronger and larger effect, it changes your perspective on things. So I'm curious, how has that impacted you?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, because I've come to learn in the last few years that money definitely isn't the end all be all. And if you try to make it the end all be all, you'll just become very tired very quickly. For me, what gets me up in the morning, I think, is being able to strengthen that creative muscle, and then combining that with the ability to focus my efforts and my talents towards helping social good organizations is really what keeps me going.
So wait, I know you had just mentioned that money isn't the end all be all. How did you learn that? Did you feel like there was a moment that made you think, hey, maybe this is not what success looks like? Or was it after achieving a certain level of success, you're like, hey, I don't feel as fulfilled as I would have otherwise felt or thought I would have felt?
I think it's a combination. I think that, once you hit those certain milestones in regards to income, you kind of get there and you're like, okay, now what? And then you set another one, and it can easily become an endless cycle. And I think also once you get to those certain income levels and you hit those, I think the fulfillment you thought you would have felt maybe isn't there, or if it is there, it's fleeting, right? So it's only there for a very short period of time.
Right.
And then it's like, okay, on to the next.
And I guess that's where we have all those midlife crises where we find that we've been chasing the wrong things all our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're like, what do we do now? That's been an important aspect in my journey as well, where now I'm trying to focus on helping underprivileged children and kids who kind of grew up in a similar circumstance, because I grew up poor and, having these feelings like I would never do anything, I would never be anything. And I really want to let them know that it really is in your head. If you tell yourself you can't do something, then you're definitely not going to do it. But I never would have thought, the success I would have had later in life. And if I had changed that view of myself and not been as self-critical, had a little bit more self-compassion, I'd probably be even farther along on my journey today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what helps you sort of, I guess, wake up in the morning is having this social impact. Now, you started the company. Can you tell me a little bit more why you started Creative Science and what the background is behind that?
Yeah, so I have an interesting background in that there's this whole idea or conversation around entrepreneurship and whether you're born with it or it's environmental. But I think that ever since I can remember, I've had an entrepreneurial tick. So I had a company in high school called Easy Selling. We used to sell items for people on eBay and then take a cut. All through college, I had a number of other entrepreneurial ventures. Even when I had a full-time job after college, I was running a company called DC3, which was a dorm room cleaning company. And my most recent company, I actually got fired from my last job. And that was really the thing that forced me to really make the leap. I had companies before, but those were side companies and things that I was doing on the side. This was the first time that I really made the leap to take a hack at this full time.
What was the situation behind you being fired? What was the psychology and your thought process behind that? What were your feelings and what emotional state did you even go through?
It's funny that I liken it very much to a breakup. I still remember it. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in this townhouse that I live with 4 or 5 other guys. It was a pretty rundown townhouse. And funny enough, this was the same table that I had sat at as a child growing up. My parents had given it to us as a hand-me-down. And I kind of remember feeling that there was something just kind of off in the last few weeks with my relationship with this company. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there just something didn't feel right. And this meeting popped up on my calendar, and it was my direct manager, was also a VP of the company, somebody that I don't think I've talked to more than 2 or 3 times. So what popped into my head was one of 2 things. Either I'm doing such an amazing job that they want to task me with this really cool initiative, or they're probably going to fire me, right? Because this VP wasn't getting on this phone call if it was just your normal run-of-the-mill call. And we got on the phone call, and they kind of cut just right to the chase, right? They said, effective immediately, we've decided to terminate your position at startup weekend. I kind of asked why, and they said it's due to performance reasons. And I think that in the moment, the first thing you try to do is you try to negotiate and sort of get your foot back in the door. And that's what I try to do. And they let me know that my decision was final. And then we hung up. They sent me a letter confirming. And the first one was sort of this anger and this, I'm no good, I can't believe I got fired type of mentality. But then as the days went on and about a week or so passed, you kind of get this feeling that this was actually probably the right thing, right? It wasn't really actually a good fit for us, for myself, or for them. And now it's on to the next thing.
So you went through the 5 stages of depression, just
Yeah.
Hey, I think we've all kind of been through there. I think the breakup is like the perfect analogy.
Yeah, right.
For when you're trying to figure out, hey man, is this a good fit or not? So, I mean, it's good that you bounce back up in a week, man. I would imagine for a lot of people, it must be a little bit harder.
And I would say, Ashwin, you had a similar experience recently, did you? And you went through a little bit of a thought process. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah. So actually, it's pretty funny too. So I was just gonna say, actually, I went through a breakup, and then after that, shortly after, I got fired from my job as well, and it happened so back to back, and I was just like, man, I went through this already just a little bit ago. So it kind of, it compounded, but it was very much the same process in a lot of ways. I think they hit different parts of your mind and actually your heart, right? And in one aspect, if it's from a relationship standpoint, you kind of wonder, is it you yourself? Is it your personality? And then from a business aspect or from a job aspect, it's like, am I not a valuable person to this organization or whatnot? But then with time, I realized that it gives you an opportunity to self-reflect and be able to be like, hey, you know what? This may just not be a right match. And that gives you an opportunity to look outwards. What else could there be? And now I'm on the pathway of trying to open up my own business, talking to a bunch of other entrepreneurs, trying to gather other information from different industries, which has been great along the way. And I realized, retrospectively being like, hey, you know what? That was actually probably the best decision, because I figured out things that I could work on. And at the same time, going somewhere in uncharted territory that I wouldn't have gone if I was to be on the same path that I was before, right? With success, there's one answer. With failures, there's a million explanations for that, and trying to figure out what those explanations are.
Yeah, I think that it provides a reset, and there was a Tony Robbins documentary. I don't know if you've watched it, but there was one point in the movie where a girl, like, she stood up and then she said that she's been having some issues. And then she said this very quick answer that she's having some trouble with her relationship. And then Tony was like, okay, you're going to call him right now and you're going to break up with him. And I later learned that she ended up going back together with him, but that served as a critical moment of one of those things where you might feel like it's not right or it's not working, but you're too comfortable and you don't know what's outside of that. And so even being fired allows you to have sort of a reset to see, where is your life? What are you thinking about? And then in some ways we rationalize, you either go in this rabbit hole of depression of like, oh, I'm no good, which is a not good way of thinking, or you rationalize why it was a bad job and blah, 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 blah. And so for you were working for that job, but were you prior an entrepreneur, and how did that job lead you into creating your next business?
Yeah. And I think that, it pushed me off the cliff, and that I was going through the same thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs are going through when they have a full-time. I was the type of person who had a full-time job, but I always had something going on the side, right? Whether it was a business or it was a side project, something I was trying to get off the ground. And I don't know. Like today, I could still very well still have a full-time job and a side business or a project if I hadn't gotten fired. It was really what forced me to do that. And I was in this mindset of, okay, I'll work a few more years. When I have enough money saved up, I'll make the leap, or when I have more resources or more not, whatever it is, right? And you play that story in your head, and I've seen people who are 40, 50 years old that are still playing that same story. There's never a good time to make that jump. And sometimes you've got to just be forced to do it. And I was fortunate in that I got fired, and I had to. I didn't really have another choice. I could have gone out and found another job, but it was just so happened at the time, two of the other guys I had worked with at Startup America, which was different than where I'd gotten fired, were thinking of starting a company. One of them was currently freelancing, and he basically said, listen, we want to take this and actually create a company out of it. Do you want to join? And I said, listen, I kind of thought to myself, it's either now or if I get another job. I don't know when I'm going to seriously take this leap again.
That's awesome, man. Hey, I'm glad to hear all this is working out for you and things are going in the right direction. You're taking your failure and putting a positive spin on it. So
thank you.
And among the failures, so besides being fired, I don't know if there's any other failures or fail clients that you're willing to share, but whenever you encounter a hard time or a problem, or you get stressed out, or you just you feel that negative critic coming on. What do you do? How do you cope with that? And how do you manage your day-to-day stress? And what did you even do after being fired? Did you just go on, did you go binge drinking, or just sort of, how did you handle that process?
I went for a swim is what I did.
You went for a swim. That was the first thing you did?
Yeah, it's a big stress reliever of mine, is just exercise. And it's not that it doesn't get easier, right? I mean, as you grow a company, you still have problems. They're just different, and they're new problems, right? There's, now you have a company, now you have payroll to meet, you've got to get sales and clients, and it doesn't end. But I think I think every time that you fail and you overcome it, you pick yourself back up, it reinforces that idea that I can do this, I can figure it out. And it reinforces this mindset that your skill isn't necessarily what it is you don't know, or you do know. It's your ability to problem solve, right? And that's what I love about entrepreneurship and about starting a company and running a company, is it's uncharted territory, right? Sure, there's playbooks and people tell you what to do, but I mean, it's all new, and it's all about figuring it out and figuring out what does and doesn't work.
Yeah, and then there were so many points up to this point where I was always, you get overwhelmed, where you think about this project that's due, or you're going to be talking, and then you just go on this all out anxiety attack in some ways, and that used to totally be me. And one of the things that actually really helped me was learning about Stoicism and learning Marcus Aurelius and all this foundation behind this way of thinking, which I know Tim Ferriss mentions as sort of like an operating system for the mind.
Yeah.
And one of the things it taught me was that you shouldn't think about things that you can't change, because you will be able to battle the future endeavors with the same aptitude and the same energy and the same person and the same tools that you have today. And it sort of taught me to not let that anxiety train go across something I can't even affect. So I only think about things I can change. And I know that whenever that future point comes, I will be able to handle it, because I can look back and all the crap I had to deal with. And I've been through some pretty shitty stuff. So there's no doubt, you sort of use that as a foundation. Have you resorted, like, what is your self-talk been? And how did you ever have that negative self-talk, or were you ever depressed, and how did you get over that, or where are you today?
I think that there's a few things. So I think the first thing is, and I've gotten out of this habit, I would say in the last 2 years, but especially when I was first starting my company, and the media does a really good job of glorifying these really young, successful entrepreneurs, right? The whole 30 under 30 Forbes, right?
Right.
And I got a little obsessed with that, right? And I felt myself compared to them starting to fall behind. And that's a really, really dangerous path to go down, because you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for somebody else. And you really should only be competing with yourself. And those are what I like to call vanity metrics, right? So it's sort of like the income thing is, you get to a certain point, or you make the Forbes 30 under 30, and it's validation, but then it's like, okay, then what? But it's, I think, really starting to learn to, and everyone says this, but really starting to embrace the journey rather than the end goal itself, and figuring out, because that's what you're really going to be doing, right? You might arrive somewhere, but it's really the journey that you need to learn to enjoy. And then for me personally, as far as the mental side goes, I've been able to internalize this idea of, like, what's the worst that could happen, right? I've gotten into big pitches or speaking engagements that I've been nervous that could have blown up. But I also think on the flip side, like, the worst thing in the world that could happen, and I start to realize, like, it's not that bad, and I would get past it, and that sort of eases me a little bit.
And bringing to your earlier point about following that journey, there was always this point where when I started to learn about photography, I would use that as my reason for traveling. But then I would always get in this photography mode of, like, oh, I have to get the perfect picture, but never really experiencing the spot that I was, or where I was at. And one of my last trips, where I went to San Francisco and I went on one of the beaches, I just remember having, like, I was in that photography mode, but then I stepped out for a moment. I had the camera right there, but then I just decided to, embrace the surrounding. And I still experience, I can still feel the wind on my hair, and just seeing the sunset and the breeze. And that's the moment that I remember. And so there's an aspect of being mindful and aware of the journey, because it's not just, getting that picture. That might be a good goal to have, but you have to appreciate your path along that. And then getting to your other point about, we have the thing that we always want to get to. And it just reminds me of like all the iPhone lines where you're standing in line to go buy a phone. And often it's actually the anticipation that we have to that up to getting that thing that is actually most desirable, that actually gives us most of the dopamine. But once we get it, like, sure, there's a little bit of like, oh, I've got this new phone, it's great. But most of the dopamine and reward will have been all the weeks or days leading up to that point. So it's so interesting how we have this opposite view of what we really want or achieve in life.
And it's interesting because Robert Sapolsky is this really great book about neuroscience and behavior. And he talks about, they've done studies at the release of dopamine in just the anticipation of receiving the reward, right? So what you're talking about is just the anticipation in and of itself starts to release those dopamine hormones.
So I want to switch gears here and sort of ask you about when you were younger and you were in high school and you were on the football team, and that seemed to be a defining moment for you. Can you tell me about what happened?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And it's funny because it's high school and it's football and everyone's like, oh, stop living in your glory days. But looking back now, it taught me a really valuable lesson. It was my senior year of high school and I was the starting quarterback, and I went to a really big high school, and as my dad say, BMOC, big man on campus. So I was like on top of the world, right? And that was like the dream in high school. The high school football quarterback, I was living the dream. And it was the third game of the season, and we had just come off a really big win. Actually, we had beaten our crosstown rivals. It was our first night game, and there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 people at the game. And third game of the season, I had a horrible game. I think I threw 3 interceptions. I think I fumbled like twice or something. And we ended up getting beat by this team that it shouldn't have even come close. And after that game, the coaches got together and they made a long, hard decision. They decided to bench me for the rest of the year. And it was a big blow to my ego because I thought I was invincible and I was on top of the world. And it was one of those things where I think you really had to just swallow your pride and do what was best for the team, right? And I had to keep moving forward and do what the coaches needed of me and just be part of the team, even though I had gone from like on top of the world to now being benched as the starting quarterback in the middle of my senior year. And frankly, it was also it was embarrassing, right? Because everybody at the school knew what happened.
What would happen, if you don't mind sharing? Or like why?
No, he got benched, right?
Yeah, I got benched. I mean, I had a horrible game. And they wanted to put in another quarterback who was more of a running quarterback because they didn't think we had much of a passing attack. So, yeah, they put me on the bench.
And when that happened, I know personally I would initially feel that feeling of resentment, right? Of like, fuck this team. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
So what was your sort of emotional journey after you had this huge blow to your ego?
I mean, that was definitely the first thing that came by. It was like, I might as well just quit, right? If they don't need me, I don't need them. But I think that the way that I was raised, and my parents always taught me this, is that you're part of the team. And you do what needs to be done for the better of the team. And it was one of those things where I just internalized that, and it was just time to swallow your pride and put on a good face, and you do what the coaches ask of you, because it's not about you, it's about the team. And if that's what they think that they need to succeed, then if you're part of the team, then you do as they say.
Well, that's great that it sounds like you learned a really, really valuable lesson. And I'm sure that impacted the way that you run your company. So, it sounds like you didn't peak in high school. So that makes one of us. All right.
Sure hope not, right?
Hey man, it looks like you're doing pretty good for yourself, right?
Thanks.
Right. So, but those are the lessons learned, right? I mean, it's good. It's better to learn it earlier on than later, right? But even if you do happen to learn some of these lessons later, the way that you take it with grace and taking yourself out of it is a very mature process, a mentality to go in with. And I think a lot of people can learn from that.
Well, I would ask, did you really learn from that? Because at the same note, there's Ryan Holiday wrote a great book called Ego is the Enemy, where he actually explores the concept that ego is us. I think Alan Watts once said that you can never get rid of an ego, but at most you can hope to be humble. And ego is an essential part of us as being human. We have to protect ourselves. So I'm curious, did that experience in high school truly teach you to separate your ego from your your existence?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. How much that taught me about it. I mean, I think some of it was a lesson of separating the two, but some of it was also, I don't want to say covering up, right? Because my ego was bruised, and there's no way to say that it wasn't, and I wasn't upset by it. And say you do put on sometimes a good face, or you act happy, even though internally you might be sad or down. So I think it was a combination of, some of it was learning to actually get past it, and some of it was just putting on a good face and just kind of sucking it up and moving on.
And with that, have you ever been depressed, or ever been like you were down in the roots of it, and how did you get from that? How did you sort of go from this low that you might have had, or that feelings of resentment or anger and hate, to being sort of more content or happy with life? And sort of where are you today? And even want to bring up the article that you wrote about the 3 levels of happiness.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought that up, because I think sometimes what happens is there's a defining moment or an event, and you can attribute, if you're sort of depressed or down and out, to that specific event, right? So a perfect example is when I got fired. But there's sometimes it's really hard to pinpoint it, right? You might go into a rut and you just might not be very motivated. You don't really feel like you're not quite with it. And it's sometimes hard to pinpoint what the reason is. And I've gone through that. And I think that every so often I do. And recently, in the last year or so, I actually started working with a personal coach on this type of thing. And it's really helped me sort of focus my energy and focus what really gets me going. And just to that article about this sort of 3 levels of happiness is, the first level are those moments, right? So you talked about the dopamine, for example, and something happens, so you feel really, really happy. The third level, which is the level that I think you should strive for, and what I do when I find myself most energized, is this: when you're growing, right? When you're being challenged, you're being creative, and you feel like you're making progress, which I have become very intentional about that. And I'm not talking about growing a company revenue-wise or size-wise. Like, I'm talking about using a skill set, being creative, figuring out problems, and using your talents. That's when I really find myself in that sort of state of flow and happiness.
I was just about to mention flow, because I know I've had some of my most creative and just amazing work where I just find flow, and I don't need caffeine. I don't need anything. Like, there's been times where I've been able to stay up until like 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. and I want to keep going, right? Just because it's coming to me and I lose track of time. What are those moments for you, by the way? Is that when you're coding? How do you enter flow?
Yeah. So there's a few different times. I think one of them is I love the mornings. I love them because, for a few reasons, especially early in the morning, because nobody else is up yet, right? So you have a nice peace, quiet time. Typically after I try to swim first thing in the morning. So after I exercise, then I do have some coffee, and it gives me an hour or two to really get in the zone. But I think it's when there's a few different ways. The first way is researching a lot of these behavioral econ theories and figuring out useful applications in the social impact and technology space of how we can apply those. The other thing, I actually play piano. It's a big creative outlet for me to be able just to sit down and improvise and mix and mash up songs. And that's also a time when I feel in a state of flow.
I know, and often people don't even realize when they enter flow, like I would say you're extremely lucky if you can find flow when you're working. But otherwise, if you go on a run, or you bicycle, or you play basketball with a gym team, those are all times where you're entering flow, because you're forgetting about the time and you're just focusing on that moment. And I think if you can find that ability to enter flow through your work, then that is just the best avenue, because you're able to get meaning and you're doing something that you love. It's not necessarily your passion, but your ability to sort of enter that moment.
Right.
So besides swimming, do you ever find flow with work, or is that just a pretty monotonous task for you?
No, I do. I do. When I have sort of quiet time to just zone in and focus. I mean, during the day, it's a little harder, right? Because I'm getting pinged on Slack, or I'm communicating with other team members, I'm meeting with clients. But when I have some time to sit down and concentrate, whether it's doing development, doing some coding, or just starting to lay out high level concepts for certain web pages or mobile applications. I put on some sort of just like quiet classical piano music and just roll.
Have you ever heard of so I don't know if you've heard of the essay by Paul Graham where he talks about the maker versus the manager and how you should separate your time, because often people just get so wound up in reactionary mode where you're getting the Slack messages and the emails. And then I've done that where it's just like I would go in and day out where I'm working the whole day and I feel like I absolutely got nothing done. And you need to be able to separate those times. So when you do enter that maker mode, when you're creating stuff, how do you block out the distractions? Is it just you put on the music? Do you change the lights? What is that mode that you enter in?
Yeah, so I try to do it. I mean, one of the key things is I've found that trying to do it during the day or at the end of the day is just not doable, just because there's so much going on. So early in the morning is really the best time. So wake up around 6 o'clock, go for a swim, and then come back, and I'm back in my apartment around 6:45, 7 o'clock, and I'll close my door. I have a nice desk in my bedroom, and I'll either put my earphones in or turn on my speaker set and turn on some just like quiet sort of classical music. And then the morning's great because nobody's up yet. There's no one to email me. There's no one to Slack message me. There's no one to Skype me. And I'm also energized. So I've tried to do this at the end of the day before, and it's really hard because you come home from a long day of work and your mind's just tired and you just want to make some dinner and you want to maybe sit around and just read a little bit and go to bed. So the morning I found has been the most effective.
And is that pretty much your morning routine where you go for that swim, you have that creative time, and then you're in manager mode for the rest of the day? And then do you read daily, or what are your other positive habits in the day?
Yeah, so I do play a fair amount of piano. So I'll also practice piano in the morning. It is a big one. I do read. So it depends. In the mornings, if I'm reading, it's more for, I would say, work study focused, right? So I'm digging into a book, maybe Sapiens, for example, and I'm sort of taking notes and really doing a deep dive and getting a really firm understanding of the material so that I can apply that to the work that I'm doing. If I am reading, I try to read in the evenings, but it can be tough a little just because you're tired. So I'll read for 20 or 30 minutes, more sort of pleasure than anything else.
So when do you have fun, man?
When do I have fun?
Yeah, when do you have fun? Yeah. See, that seems like that's the question that tripped you up the most. You're like, when do I have fun? Question mark.
When do I have fun? I have fun on the weekends. I do. I have fun on the weekends. The weeks, for me, piano and swimming and those types of things, those are fun. I do like to socialize during the week. I find it a little tough, to be honest with you. I know for a fact if I go out, if I have a beer or 2 beers,
right.
I mean, I'm not even I wouldn't even consider drinking. I'm just not getting up the next morning at 6 o'clock. I'm going to get up at 7:30 or 8, and then it throws my whole day off. And then that whole sort of peaceful time that I have in the mornings is completely gone.
Right. So are you saying are you not able to get as many beers? And do you like to keep that constant routine even on the weekends?
The weekends, not. No, the weekends I'll go out.
Okay. All right, the real Nate comes out.
And rage a little bit. But I like to try as best as I can to keep the week sort of structured, very structured. The weekend's a little bit more free flowing. But I mean, I'll be honest with you. I know drinking is not conducive to being productive. Those things just don't go hand in hand. And even on the weekends, because the weekends, what I'm talking about here, I also do them on the weekends on a Saturday morning. I mean, I'm not going to wake up at 6 o'clock, right? But I still like that sort of routine. And if I'm hungover, I can read a book. I just can't really read. I won't remember anything that I read, and then it's just a waste.
Yeah. So. It's an existential crisis I go through every weekend as well, man. I'm like, why do I do this to myself?
Right.
Somehow I go through these repeated behaviors. Okay. Right. As well. Right. But it's good that you have some social time out too. Right. I think in some ways it's another way to reset.
Sure.
Believe it or not.
And I think that, it's tough too, because I think you look back at the weekend and you go, okay, what was it about the weekend that I really enjoyed and really made me happy? Right. Was it going out Saturday night and blacking out?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun, but then Sunday's shot, and I maybe would have rather had Sunday to be productive and swim and bike and do all these types of things. So it's a trade-off. I've read that very successful people have given up drinking, and I'm like, I bet there's a little bit of a correlation there.
I think you're probably right at some capacity, right? It's like hashtag adulting. I don't know how long we can keep on using that, but I think it applies in this case, right?
So you seem to honestly be in, I would say, the top 1% of people who have good habits and are able to maintain a routine. Did you always see it that way? Did you ever, like personally, like I wake up every day and I go to the gym and I write and I read and I meditate, and I have these various habits and they sort of set the foundation for my day. But of course, when it comes to the weekend, like all bets out the window.
Right.
But it took me years to get to this mindset of being able to establish these habits. And so did you always see reading as something that you were going to do on a daily basis, and swimming? Was this always something that you were doing, or did you have to work yourself up? And if so, how did you do that?
Yeah. So some of them, yes, some of them, no. Exercise has always been a big part of what I do. I mean, since I can kind of remember, I've always been exercising. So that's always been sort of ingrained in me. And then these habits, when you first create them, they're tough, but then they become really hard to break. So now I swim so much that if I don't swim for 2 days, I get really edgy and I get irritated and my body craves it. And that's a good place to be in, right? As far as waking up really early, reading, those types of things, that's more in the last year and a half, right? So those are habits I've developed, just from sort of looking at my professional trajectory, meeting with this career coach of, if you want to be able to do certain things, you've got to structure your life in such a way. And I started to realize that if I was going to get really serious about being able to actually get good at the piano, like if I really wanted to be able to read and learn, to be more creative, I needed to do it in the mornings. It wasn't going to happen after work. It wasn't going to happen during the day. So started to develop more of these other habits that I've been talking about.
That's awesome. And you also meditate, correct?
I try to. I have my Headspace app. I wouldn't say I do it regularly. I know I should do it.
Right. We should be all doing a lot of things, right?
Right.
I mean, you got swimming and piano playing and reading down. So
yeah.
I think you'll be forgiven for not meditating, But no, it's funny though. Like same thing with me, man. I just started meditating very recently, and it sounds like we've been on somewhat similar journeys. I did the same thing where I looked at what other successful people are doing and just reverse engineered what they were to be doing. Right. So, I mean, it's now everybody's like, oh, you don't meditate, bro. Like, what's wrong with you? Right. But so I was like, oh man, I guess I wanted to be with all the cool kids. Right. And so I started doing some Headspace too. And the way eventually, like I started off really, really easy. I was like, I'm going to do like 5 minutes, like twice a week. And then I started building myself up a little bit more. Now I'm like at 20 minutes, maybe like 4 times a week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like, I know people that like take like 3-week vacations, like twice a year to go to meditation camps. I'm like, man, I don't know how you do that, but you're going to reach nirvana. You're going to be hanging out with Buddha if you're keeping up those tactics. Right. But no, I mean, it's really cool that like, it looks like, right. I can tell for myself, it's given me a little bit more self-awareness and understanding of my emotional states. And it also reflects, not to say I'm a very irritable person in general. I think I have a tendency of having a more agreeable nature, but I do have this awareness a little bit more of my surroundings, which is, it's really interesting how that all plays into effect. So I think Cody calls having a series of really good habits the success spiral.
Well, yeah, that was actually from this really great book called The Motivation Hacker, in which he talked about the success spiral, because most of the procrastination and the problems that we have in getting to do something is actually just our anxiety about it. And one of the ways that you can help defeat that is if you just make it a very small task. So I'm able to still do meditation on the weekends. I do it during the weekday, but I can do it on the weekends simply because I tell myself, you know what, look, I'm only going to do it for 1 minute. And as shitty as I may feel, I'm still able to do it just for 1 minute. And the important part is that you have to be self-compassionate. You have to not be, you shouldn't lie to yourself and be like, oh, I'm only going to do 1 minute, and then secretly think that you're going to do 10 minutes, because then you're just not going to do it. You have to be willing to do that minimum amount, but then to be okay with yourself. And that's how you're sort of able to build these success spirals where you're able to consistently knock out the habits, which is very small increments. And going back to one of the things that you said earlier, there's this idea that, if you have to have these foundations in set in order to be successful. I really don't think you can be a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company if you're somebody that can't make your bed in the morning. And we have this wrong view of happiness, where we want all these things because we think that they'll make us happy. And of course, most of society, if you have this conversation, people are going to say, oh yeah, I know that. But oddly, we don't really follow what we all seem to talk about. And it's interesting where we have this idea of oh, I forgot my point, but I want to ask you to clarify your 3 levels of happiness, and just tell me again, because we kind of got lost in the whole habits, and tell me about those 3 levels of happiness, and maybe I'll get my thought back.
Sure. So the first one is, like I talked about, these fleeting moments, right? So those are going to sporting events, going to concerts, things that just make you happy or in the moment, right? And then the second level of happiness is contentment. So that's a lot of what they talk about with meditation, being able to get comfortable with the way things are and not trying to change things. Like you said before, Cody, of just accepting things at the way that they are. And this is what the Buddhists talk about in that idea of meditation. And then the third level of happiness is this idea is thought of as the highest level of happiness. And that's when you're flourishing and you're totally fulfilled. You're fulfilling your potential and you're growing, whether it's personally or professionally.
Right. And my thought was that you really can't be happy. And, you never heard of a depressed CEO who's building a multi-million-dollar company. You have to be happy and content with your life in order to build the success that you aspire to have. And, so we have this opposite view of happiness where we need to be content with what we have. And that's also been helpful with, I used to have this gratitude journal where I still have it, where if I have moments where it's just like, I feel like I'm going through a low period, I'll start to bring that out and just fill that out every day, because there's science that shows when we think about what we're grateful for, what we already have, then that actually will make us happier. And that has almost a similar effect of antidepressants in terms of raising that serotonin level. So that's the 3 levels of happiness that you've stated on. And
I have a question, Nate, though. So do you feel like your happiness and your productivity go hand in hand, or do you feel they can be independent? Because I would say when I was going through dental school, man, I wouldn't call that the happiest moments of my life, but I was fairly productive and working through it. And I listened to Tim Ferriss somewhat recently, and he had mentioned a little bit offhandedly that a lot of people that are high productive, highly efficient people aren't necessarily happy, but they can still have a lot of output. But I noticed for myself, for me personally, the more happy I am, it directly bleeds into my work, and I perform at a higher state than I would have otherwise. So do you feel like that's the same case for you, or do you think that they can be independent, and for what it's worth, they don't always have to go hand in hand?
So I would say that they are interdependent, but I would also say that productivity is very different than growth, right? Just because you're creating a lot of output does not mean you're necessarily growing. I find I am most happy when I'm not necessarily productive, when I'm growing, and when I'm growing, I'm typically also productive. So I think that's the delineation I would make between the two.
When you're growing, right? Do you feel, there's like pain points, right? Like that is a moment of, do you feel happy during those times? Like say you got fired or you got benched, right?
Right.
That was a growing experience, right? Maybe not at that time, but when you're sucking it up, you didn't feel happy particularly, right?
No, I didn't. I guess when I say growing, I mean, sort of there's the sense of growing, of looking back on experience, but there's also this sort of like state of flow, right? When you're really sort of when you're flexing that creative muscle, right? And you're pushing the envelope when it comes to whatever it is that you're working on. I mean, that's when you're growing in that regard. That's when I would say I feel the most happy.
Yeah, it's making progress, right?
Right.
Is that feeling that you're doing something? And I once made the mistake where I was thinking that, okay, I want to build all these businesses, and I'm going to separate my time. So like on Monday, I'm going to work on this business. On Tuesday, I'm going to work on this business. Or like I would try and separate it every week, and it just never worked because I felt like I was never making any progress on any of the companies. And it sort of led to this burnout, depression. And it took me a while to realize that it was really actually related to this feeling of accomplishment. And that was the most significant factor in my productivity, regardless of how happy I felt about the work I was doing. It was that feeling of accomplishment.
Exactly.
I mean, I think oftentimes when we think about growth, we focus really on like our work or in a lot of ways. But do you feel like there's areas that you're growing or any areas that you're trying to work on that you see that you may have either blind spots or areas of improvement that you're like, you know what, I need to work on this?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I got a coach too, is to have somebody else point out my blind spots. I think sometimes I can be impatient. I think that I want things to move quicker than they are. I also think that I have sometimes an inability to see, I don't want to say things from another angle, but from somebody else's point of view. And I'm not just talking about sitting down and saying like, oh, I understand where you're coming from. I'm saying like really understand and being able to empathize where somebody else is coming from. So then you can better relate to them and figure out, what truly motivates them and what truly makes them tick. So you can both get after the same goal.
Yeah, I know actually even one of those strategies is when somebody is arguing their point, we're always instantly trying to think, okay, how can we overpower their point? But one way of actually empathizing with them is to actually restate what they're trying to say from the perspective that you understand it. And so you're just restating their point, trying to understand it. And that actually can diffuse arguments. And that is really one way of being empathetic with somebody in a situation where you're argumentative or there's emotions and there's lots of problems involved.
I find that's really great that you're working on that. I think it's very, very difficult, especially in this day and age, to actually empathize with another person, or at least try understanding where their lens is. Because most people think everybody's making the right decision, right?
Right.
But to be able to truly see it, you have to try understanding all their assumptions and try understanding their biases. And it's not so much, I would like to think about who's right and who's wrong, but rather a collaborative effort to gain knowledge of the truth. So that's great that you're working on that, man. I think that's what makes for a very good entrepreneur and CEO, that it's your personal coach is going to bleed over also into your company. So
yeah, thank you.
Right.
What I've realized with that too is that when I do get frustrated in those situations, it's oftentimes that we're both working towards the same thing, right? We both want the same thing. You might just be coming at it from a completely different angle than I'm coming at it. And I think if you start to realize that they're not out to get you, right? They're trying to get to the same place you are. They're just coming from a different angle. It helps you start to realize and internalize what it is that they're seeing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's very well put, man.
And so we're getting near the end of the podcast, and I wanted to just lastly touch on these self-limiting beliefs. And when you've hired your coach or your mentor, it seems that they've had a big impact in helping you to sort of reframe your reality. And so I'm curious, what would you say to listeners, to anybody who feels like they're kind of at a dead end job, or they don't really know where they want to go to in life? And of course, I think you've had sort of an entrepreneurial background. You've sort of gone on that route, and not everybody is an entrepreneur, but I'm curious where you stand on this idea of having these negative beliefs, and how did you grow personally from that in order to become somebody with a growth mindset and trying to achieve something?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. The first thing I would say is that I talk to a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs, and oftentimes you'll see that somebody's waiting for something to start something, right? I need to quit my job. I need to raise money. I need to find a technical co-founder. Just get started. I mean, I started multiple businesses before I started this current company, right? Just because I had a full-time job that didn't stop me from doing it. Prior to my last company, I had no idea how to code, and I needed someone to build a technical product. So I taught myself how to code, right? So figure out a way to get started and get moving. Like you said, Cody, is just take that first step, like do that 1-minute meditation or do that first part of whatever it is that you want to be doing, and figure out a way to start making progress towards your goals. The other thing is with the limiting beliefs. I mean, sometimes, to be honest with you, it takes, and I remember talking to my coach about this, and I used to always think, why would I need a coach, right? Why do you need a coach? Why would entrepreneurs need a coach? But the greatest athletes in the world have coaches, right? Tom Brady has God knows how many coaches, and he's the greatest quarterback to ever play the game. They're going to see things that you can't see. And when it comes to limiting beliefs, they're going to be able to help you sort of retrain your mind to overcome some of those limiting beliefs. Because we all know that we have limiting beliefs and we shouldn't have them, but it's more so of figuring out how do you actually get over those. I mean, that's the hard part.
Right. That's great. You know, I've actually personally, I've never considered a personal coach. And I think that a lot of, I mean, I could benefit from it. I think a lot of our listeners could probably at least take it into consideration, because we're all trying to, in order to get to that third level of happiness, we need to be able to grow. Right. And it's good to get somebody who's a little bit more objective to be able to, yes. Right? Because, I mean, for example, when I go through some sort of difficulty, I usually go through my friends and we all talk about it, but you know, your friends have they have your best intentions, and a lot of them are trying to give, oftentimes they're very gentle with their approach, right? Mm-hmm. And having a personal coach that can keep you also accountable, that's dedicated to you, can definitely impact people in a lot of positive ways.
And I just want to end with a quote, actually, that's very relevant from a book called Barking Up the Wrong Tree by Eric Barker. And this is just a section from the book on this exact topic. And I think it'd be very helpful to anybody who's in the need of a coach, or even trying to find out why you want to have a coach. Stay in the picture. You are easily forgotten by busy people. Remember that. The key then is to find ways to stay relevant and fresh. Drop emails and questions at an interval that straddles the fine line between bothersome and buzzworthy. It's easier to keep something alive than it is to revive the deceased, but it's on you to keep the blood flowing, not the mentor. You need to consistently hit them with a conversation defibrillator to keep the relationship alive, but without being a nuisance. Do what they said, get results, and let them know that they made a difference. This is what mentors want. If they engage, you can follow up with, I did my homework and figured out some really impressive steps. Would be blank, fill in the blank. But I love your insight. Do you think well thought out strategy 1 or well thought out strategy 2 is better? You want these interactions to become conversational back and forths, not one-offs. And I think, and end quote. And I think that's the one mistake that a lot of people make, is that they see a mentor as somebody just to ask questions, but it's really more of a relationship, and it can even be beneficial to both parties involved. And you need to keep that mentorship, that relationship going by being the person that's willing to engage with that person. And so often I've had mentors just where I don't follow up, and then it just becomes a stale relationship. And then I lose that ability to get that other perspective of myself and where I'm going wrong, because we all have this narrative about ourselves and who we are. And unless we get other people telling us alternative perspectives, we can just sort of get lost in this bubble of ourselves where we're not really growing. So that's I just wanted to mention that quote because it just seemed a very relevant section, and I should have mentioned that it was talking about how to create and sustain a relationship with a mentor.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Well, I think we're near the end. So Nate, I want to thank you again for being here with us in this hour. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Much appreciated.
Thanks, man. Hey, it was great talking to you. Let's stay in touch.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Take care, man.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.